Hello and welcome to another episode of Political State from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder and today is Friday, February 9th. And we were just with you a few days ago as a new legislative session kicked off on Monday at the Capitol. Governor Mary Fallon's State of the State address. Me and the rest of the Political State crew broke down what she had to say, but the week ended with a series of budget bills passing out of committee that really set the stage for some political theater next week. So in this week's episode, we're going old school. It's me and the Capitol reporter for the Oklahoman, Dale Denwall. Dale, just like the good old days when we started this thing, just you and me.
Yeah, but now we have lights and cameras and everything else.
Yeah, so, well, like I said, the week started with the kind of normal pomp and circumstance of a new legislative session, Governor Mary Fallon's State of the State address, and everybody responds to that. But it ended with a series of budget bills passing through committee on Thursday. First, give us kind of a rundown of what we saw yesterday.
Right, so these are the Step Up Oklahoma proposals. The Joint Committee on Appropriations and Budget, that's the tool that lawmakers use to pass these big budget bills. All of those bills that were introduced came out of committee. Not all the proposals in the Step Up plan, but the more than $500 million in new revenue for next year, and several million dollars to fill the current year hole. And they came out of the JCAB committee, and probably going to see them on the floor Monday.
Yeah, was it a surprise that it sailed through committee like it did? I mean, I know there's, we'll talk about next week here in a few moments, but was there any drama with the votes on Thursday?
Well, the only notable thing about the vote is that out of 7 Democrats on the JCAB committee, only 2 supported it. Now, a lot of the things, and I'm talking about the big budget bill, includes increases on taxes for gross production, gasoline, cigarettes, and a new tax in that bill is the tax on wind production or wind generation. And it was pretty much a party line vote, although 2 Democrats crossed over and voted for that measure, indicating that there is some Democratic support. And the real key here is to see will it have enough votes to pass the House on Monday. They need 76. Republicans alone don't have 76. And there could be some Republicans who don't want to vote for a $500 million tax increase, who may decide to go against it. So Speaker McCall's going to need even more Democrats to come across the aisle. Yeah, well, we've been talking for the last few weeks, probably longer than that, just about these series of tax increase bills and what it's going to take to see them become a reality. That high, as you say, that high voter threshold of getting 3/4 of the legislature on board. It starts with the House. We've talked about whether or not we think the votes are there. With the vote happening maybe just a couple days from now, any better sense on what it may look like when the votes are cast? I've talked to several people who really at this point can only offer their opinion of what might happen. Most of them are not optimistic that it will have enough votes to pass. There's still a lot of time between now and Monday, I don't have a whip count. I haven't asked every member of the legislature how they're going to vote on this. I think only a couple of people probably have, and they're still working. I talked to one person on Friday who said that seemingly the vote changed every time he took a whip count. And so it really depends on who's on board on the day that this comes up for a vote.
Yeah, well, and part of that change is going to have, you talk about what can change in the next couple of days. A heavy presence of lobbyists this week, as there always is at the Capitol, but especially this week it seemed like. And you talk to lawmakers, and I was at a function last night and ran into a few lawmakers, and they were just talking about basically being chased around the building by lobbyists who are trying to get this. And a lot are in favor. I mean, we've talked about the various groups that have signed up in support of this, the education associations, and the State Chamber of Commerce is backing this. So there's a lot of probably a lot of big lobbying guns that are advocating in favor. There's some that aren't, but it seems like a lot of effort is behind this. And this isn't really a partisan issue per se, because you look at both sides of the aisle. there's a need to probably flip some more votes. So you have your, there's going to be a group of Republicans who are just not going to support a tax increase anyways. But you have those kind of, they're not quite moderate, but would normally, it would take a lot to get them to vote that may be on the fence. And then the Democrats right now, as we've talked about, this is kind of, they have some problems with these bills, but this is also a moment for them to kind of flex their political muscle. They don't get a chance to do so often.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Democrats continue to hold their line. Obviously we may see some crossover like we did in the JCAP committee, but for the most part, Democrats as a whole really held the cards here. Mm-hmm. They've got more than 24 votes that if they come together, they can have enough votes to push this over the edge and send it on to the Senate and then to the governor. But it's an election year, and there may be some political calculation going on that the longer that this is drawn out, the worse that those in charge look. Mm-hmm. Right? I wouldn't put it past a politician to think that way. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, even if the Democrats eventually are going to come on board, it's hard to imagine them rushing to come on board on this.
Right.
They're probably going to play the slogan. We've talked about this before. Republicans, those that are in favor of this would like to get this voted and done as quickly as possible. I suppose for McCall, the best thing for him, Speaker McCall, is that within the first week of the session, or the first 2 weeks of session, is getting this through and moving on. Putting as much distance between that vote and the June primaries as possible. Democrats, not so much.
Well, and they've been trying to do that since last year.
Yeah.
But Democrats have some very real concerns with the bill. They, for the most part, contend that it taxes working families and poor people more than it does the upper class. They point to so-called regressive taxes, like the taxes for cigarettes or the gasoline tax, which everyone pays the gasoline tax, but if you don't make a whole lot of money, you're paying more of your paycheck for that particular product.
Yeah.
And so they also say that the wind tax is unfair to the industry, and they point to a couple of things, some promises that supposedly were made about maintaining the wind industry's incentives after some cuts over the last 3 years. And they have a real tough time supporting this bill because it contains several things that, several tax raises that they really don't agree with.
Yeah, I was talking to a Democratic lawmaker this week, and we were talking about just this kind of, trying to kind of get a sense for, where they might be on the vote. And we were talking about the election year pressures that might push a lawmaker one way or the other. And this lawmaker, asked me the question, like, well, what Democrat is facing election pressure? And when you really think about it, and I don't have the whole list in front of me, but it's an interesting thing. I can think of a lot of Democratic races or Democratic lawmakers in the House where I feel like they're probably pretty safe. There's a lot of Republicans that are the same way. Yeah. I think of someone though like Representative Munson, Cindy Munson. Was successful in flipping her seat a couple of years ago. That's a very moderate kind of northwest part of the city. Maybe you have a couple others like that, but that's really where I think where it would be interesting to see those votes. The Democrats right now, where a lot of their power is in their urban cores. Of the cities, where they're probably not feeling a lot of pressure from their constituents, especially if they have a pretty progressive base. Because a lot of that progressive base is saying, hey, these taxes aren't, they're especially not hitting oil and gas as hard as we would like to see. So I think it's going to be kind of interesting. I think about the Democrats, I'm not sure what election pressure they're facing as a whole, with the exception of, maybe 1 or 2 members like Munson.
Well, certainly, and if you get out in the rural areas and find a more conservative Democrat, they may feel pressure from their base or from their electorate, from their constituents, to not raise their taxes.
Yeah.
More conservative parts of the state, I don't know for sure which Democrat is the most vulnerable. I guess we'll see come November, but I think the more important political calculation for Democrats right now, if they're making one, is can we spin our disapproval of these tax increases into, or what can we do to gain more seats, to gain the governor's office? And if the state is still in shambles when November comes, then we'll have done our job, so to speak. That may be what people are thinking.
Yeah, well, last year's leader of the Democratic caucus in the House, Scott Inman, is no longer running the show.
Right.
Any sense of how a change in leadership has that changed at all? You feel like the organization, the message, just the energy of the Democratic
We're not
caucus?
having as many press conferences.
That's true. Yeah.
I think where the Democrats stand is pretty much the same. I don't see much of a shift in the policies. They still support the proposals that they introduced a year ago in the Restore Oklahoma plan. And when they talk about increasing taxes on oil and gas, they talk about 7%, and they're willing to go down to 5%. And so not a lot has changed as far as what the Democrats supposedly will support. What we have seen is maybe a less vocal, a less hard-driving Democratic caucus in the public eye.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about Democrats because they're crucial to a tax increase measure passing,
Right.
but so are Republicans.
Yes.
And it sounds like there's still going to need to be an increase in Republicans that are supporting this. I mean, you talked about some of those rural areas not wanting to increase their taxes. I also think about some of these rural areas that are maybe a lot more pro wind energy. A lot of these agriculture communities where they've really seen those make a big difference. In fact, we saw one group kind of come out in support of Lamb for governor this week. I mean, so there's a lot of interest. Interests are different depending on where you are in the state, and right now in rural Oklahoma, it seems like that's a big battle right now.
Yeah, and especially in western Oklahoma, you have, and southern Oklahoma, you have lawmakers who have wind projects in their area, and they've they talk about the benefits to their local economy and their local tax base because of having these projects. And for the most part, if you are a legislator with a big wind farm in your district, you're going to be a little bit upset at these taxes that are being proposed.
Yeah.
On the wind industry.
Yeah. Well, just like we talk about with oil and gas, I think it's really easy, especially in a state like Oklahoma, for oil and gas companies to convince communities that something that hurts them is going to hurt you, even if these communities, even if the person isn't directly employed in oil and gas. I mean, we talk about some of the cities. I mean, you're familiar with some of these West Oklahoma towns where the impact of energy, of oil and gas is present. And I think for a lot of Oklahomans, even if they're not employed by one of these companies, there's just a fear of what that ripple effect would look like. And I think the same is true for wind energy, especially when you look at the last decade. I mean, the presence of wind has just exploded in a lot of places. And you could argue is a lot more visible in some ways, just by the fact that these are these giant towers that are, encircling towns in some places. And we've seen some schools that have kind of used wind energy as a way to survive, budget cuts. And so, both industries are crucial in different parts of the state. And right now, these two industries are really kind of dueling with each other, over this tax increase package.
Right. Yeah. It's and I've heard some people say that the robustness of the debate in trying to get trying to end the wind power incentives and even enact a new production tax on wind is a political move by the oil and gas interests. That's just sort of the scuttlebutt you hear around the Capitol. Because someone's got to find someone to blame for just about everything. Yeah. And I've personally been trying to find out where does this sudden renewed interest in the wind industry come from, and still remains to be seen what the driving force is, other than some people just wanting to end these wind incentives that they say are very lucrative and have been for the last decade.
Yeah. It's one thing for lawmakers that are feeling pressure from businesses, they're feeling pressure from lobbyists, they're feeling pressure from PACs and donors in an election year like this. It'll be interesting to see what kind of pressure they start kind of feeling from Oklahomans, but kind of organized groups. And I bring that up because on Monday we have, some of these votes are likely to take place. I know a lot of these education associations are really trying to, have a big presence at the Capitol. I mean, I've heard of numbers as high as 9,000, possibly on Monday.
Yeah.
And I think that, it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact that has. And I've talked about this before. I think the Step Up group, one of the big gets for them is getting a lot of these education organizations on board. Not that they would have been against it, but for them to actually sign their name to it, I think could be pretty impactful. In fact, one lawmaker I was talking to is like, the lobbyists have kind of been a pain, some of the other things, but man, you start seeing some teachers at the Capitol. That's it starts to make a difference.
And the teacher pay bill, which is part of the package, passed unanimously yesterday. And I don't think that it would, if you put it up for a vote, I don't think it would ever have any trouble. But the problem is that teacher pay raise is tied to the revenue that you're going to get in this big House Bill 1033. So you're going to see that one go up before the teacher pay increase.
Yeah. Well, you've covered the Capitol for a while, and I think it's important to realize or to point out that there's a lot of people who I think if Monday comes and the vote fails or it can't pass on Monday, there's going to be a lot of frustrations and probably a continued feeling among some Oklahomans that this is a mess.
Yeah.
But if it were to pass on Monday, that's quick. I mean, that would be kind of unprecedented from what we've seen, right? One, a tax increase, obviously,
yes.
But getting something of that kind of magnitude, or getting a budget, through in the first week of the session, even though this is part of the second session, but this first kind of week of all the attention at the Capitol, that would still that's a heavy lift in any year.
It certainly is, and it's heavy because everyone kind of took the Christmas break off, the holiday break, for New Year's, and you get their kids back in school, and finally we're kind of ramping up to focus on politics again. But the thing to remember is there's really nothing in this bill aside from the wind production. There's nothing in this bill that lawmakers haven't seen or voted on before. It's all been voted. It was voted on in November, and as a policy idea, these aren't new ideas. As bills, certainly yes. We only saw the final versions of these bills a few minutes before the committee started, and so that's one thing there. And to get sort of a political victory sort of this early in session when everyone is focused again on what's happening is important, I think, for the majority. But these are ideas that are well worn.
Yeah, and if the vote were to fail, or if the votes aren't there and they don't bring it to the floor, that's not the end of this.
Right. Yeah. This is being brought up in special session.
Yeah.
They're having a concurrent regular session and special session. So JCAB was a special session JCAB meeting. They can continue special session all the way up until the end of this legislative session, this legislature, up until the end of the year, really. But they want to get it done as quickly as possible. So.
Yeah. I think you wrote earlier this week. It feels like a year. Earlier this week that we've seen 4 sessions so far in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
It's been an interesting year in politics.
It's been really incredible.
Yeah.
But if this package of bills doesn't pass on Monday, or if it isn't brought up, they still have a little bit of time to get something done. Really, I think it kind of boils down to it's just a matter of weeks, because what they're trying to do most importantly is fill the budget hole that's still left in this fiscal year. This fiscal year ends at the end of June. There are 3 agencies that will run out of money 2 months shy of the end of the fiscal year. And unless the legislature comes up with some kind of revenue, releases some money, these agencies are going to have to make a decision very quickly on how they're going to spread out the money that they do have to the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah.
Now, all of the revenue that was advanced out of committee yesterday doesn't cover all of the costs that it would take to fully fund these agencies, to fully fund this fiscal year. However, the appropriations chair said that he has word from Governor Fallon that she would be okay with using one-time money sort of digging into the couch cushions again. If they pass this recurring revenue for next year and the following years, that she'll be okay with, okay, let's also dig into the couch cushions and find enough money just to finish this year.
Yeah, yeah. Well, how different does it feel at the Capitol this year? I mean, right now. I mean, how? Like I said, I know we're talking about the difference in having a vote of this magnitude so early on, but just kind of politically speaking,
there's no excitement.
No excitement?
None.
What do you mean by that?
Hardly any excitement. Usually, when session starts, everyone is sort of eager, ready to go, and looking for jostling to find their place in policy and the political eye. Everyone still seems really exhausted from these two special sessions and the inability to really get anything done as far as funding state government on a recurring basis. And the enthusiasm that you usually see with people excited to present their bills really isn't there, because everyone's still so focused on how are we going to make sure that we don't run out of money.
Yeah. Well, you don't even have that kind of built in of having a new freshman class too. I mean, we're not coming off an election year. Sometimes you have wide-eyed new lawmakers coming in that don't know any better, maybe. So they're still excited, but not. I mean, with the exception of a couple that have won some special elections this year. So that's interesting. It did kind of feel that way, I thought, on Monday. We had the state of the state felt rather pretty normal. I mean, in terms of just the atmosphere of it. I mean, we did see some hecklers and some, booing back and forth between the governor. It feels like the governor booed back. Is that right? Did you see that?
I didn't see that.
KOSU reported that, and we don't have video, but you had the group with the banner, and then you had another woman that was yelling, and it looks like she responds audibly in some way. Anyways,
well, I'll take a look at that.
Kind of the state of Oklahoma right now. Oklahomans are booing the governor's booing them. I mean, it's just, you're right.
It really feels like here we go again.
Yeah.
At the Capitol.
But when we were, a few hours after the speech, and we were doing kind of our state of the state, breakdown episode, and I remember just like it just felt empty. Like I don't know if people cleared out quicker. There just wasn't a lot of people hanging around. You're right. I mean, it just kind of seems like it hasn't been that exciting of a start to the. I mean, exciting if you're a political wonk and really wanting to follow some drama. Yeah. But not if you're if you are someone who actually enjoys the legislative process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels like another slog through. Politics and the legislative session. I'm kind of speaking for myself, but I think it's true for a lot of people that until there is some kind of fix to the budget, until the legislature can move on, it's going to be a real sort of emotional drain on people.
Yeah.
Who would probably rather focus on policy. Than how the state's going to raise money.
Yeah, this is usually kind of how it feels in May, right?
Yeah.
And even yesterday when people I was following along on Twitter and so many people were tracking the vote. I'm like, you don't normally see that in the first. I mean, this is the time for, like I said, that excitement for crazy bills, for us to be talking about bills that have no chance. But you get a lot of attention anyways. You get a chance to talk to a lot of the activists, on all these kind of sides, and we're being cheated out of that experience this year. Is what it feels like. But important work to do. Is there anything else going on besides the budget right now? I mean, I know there's lots of bills have been filed, obviously, but is there anything of importance that people are talking about or focusing on? Or is it really right now?
Criminal justice is still a big topic and. Something that is going back to, I wouldn't say going back to the drawing board, but is kind of in limbo right now. There were a number of criminal justice measures, criminal justice reform measures, that have the goal of reducing the prison population through various means, either reducing the number of people going into prison or making sort of loosening the rules on letting some people who are in prison and who will be for a long time, sort of easing them back out into the community. And those bills were kicked back to the conference committee. Conference committee is where bills go when the House and Senate can't agree on language, and there are some advocates who are really worried that because these bills are going back into the conference committee where they can be amended, that they're going to be watered down in some way.
Yeah.
And so we'll be watching to see what comes out of conference committee, if anything. It's very possible that these bills could simply disappear. I don't think that'll happen, but the end result could be that what people thought was going to pass last year with criminal justice reform might be something very different when these bills do eventually come back up for a vote.
Yeah, well, when we talked about it on Monday and found State of the State address, I mean, clearly the biggest applause line was, you know,
Yes.
her talking about transitioning from, you know, a tough on crime to a smart on crime approach.
She said that we're warehousing
Yeah.
men and women and parents and people with mental illness and people with drug addiction. And her pointing that out really sort of caught the attention of lawmakers who might have been sitting on their hands, and they all, for the most part, jumped up and applauded her.
Yeah, and quite widely in bipartisan ways. And I think, you know, we've talked before about, you know, just going back, you know, 3, 4, 5 years ago, how hard it would be to believe then that we'd be in a year now where, you know, so many, you know, Republican lawmakers were willing to vote for a tax increase, even though we haven't seen that magic number yet of 76, or at least a combined number that reaches 76. I think the same could be true a little bit about criminal justice.
Yeah,
criminal reform. I mean,
Republicans are now for raising taxes and letting people out of jail.
yeah, what's going on?
Yeah, I don't know.
Interesting times in Oklahoma, and it'll continue to be interesting. Justin Wingerter, who's on the federal beat, is out of town. We may have tried to Skype with him this week if the federal government shutdown had prolonged more than it was, but most people went to bed with the budget and with a funded government and woke up with a funded government. So last night's budget or government closing didn't last very long.
Yeah, I wasn't following it directly, but I noticed that occasionally when I would check news, it would say a deal is moving forward, the government's going to not shut down. And then I checked 20 minutes later, though the government's going to shut down.
Yeah.
And then you check a little bit later on, everything's okay, they've found
Yeah.
a deal. I know the government's going to shut down. I couldn't even imagine being on Capitol Hill, being in Washington, D.C., covering that. I mean, we've had a little bit of that here,
Yeah.
especially with the late night committee meetings toward the end of session last year. But it's really incredible how down to the line that these incredibly
Yeah.
important funding bills go at in Congress.
Yeah, well, Congress got it done last night,
Yeah.
and you know, in this kind of, we talk about the comparisons between D.C. and Oklahoma government quite a bit, and in the race for dysfunction, or to not be dysfunctional. Right now, I think Washington, D.C. has the upper hand a little bit.
Come out ahead.
And a week where, you know, Fallon mentioned her state of the state, we don't want to be like D.C. Well, D.C. has got their budget, so Oklahoma, it's your move now, and we'll see what happens in the coming days.
Looking at you, Oklahoma.
Yeah. So, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoman. It's good to just to chat with you, Dale. Like I said, like old times, all the way back a year ago when we launched this show. Well, we'll be back next Friday. Will be something to talk about, whether or not it's a passage of a tax increasing measures to fund the government or another stalled attempt. Dale, we'll have you back on to talk about how that goes, and we'll continue to follow you at News OK and in the Oklahoman to see how things go. Well, for the Oklahoman with Dale, I'm Ben. This has been Political State. We will see you again next week.